Hello, everyone. You're listening to the Paradigm Shifts podcast with your host, Keisha Kruger. I'm an organization development practitioner and executive coach, working with leaders to create positive changes in the workplace using behavioral science. My personal mission? Share science-based tools and leadership insights from the field that you can use in the workplace and beyond. Considering we spend about 3/4 of our lifetime at work, there is incredible science and organizational psychology that can be used to rethink the way we work, lead, and ultimately live. Join me as I speak with thought leaders and business leaders in practice, unpacking light bulb moments for paradigm shifts. On this week's episode, we get to speak with Erika on the topic of narcissism in the C-suite. Erika is a talent development consultant and executive coach for organizations. She's also the founder and directing partner of Ascendry. Ascendry provides transformational organizational data collection and analyses, talent development, and executive leadership coaching services. Their mission is to make talent development accessible to every organization. If you want to learn more about Erika and her services, you can visit her website at www.ascendry.com. Erika, I am so excited for you to be here on this episode talking about narcissism in the C-suite. I have been thinking about this topic for weeks now. And I don't know if you've recognized the uptick in the use of narcissism lately across social media. I sure have. I'm seeing it on LinkedIn. I'm seeing people talk about it in Instagram. You're doing your dissertation on this topic. Is that right?
I am.
Okay. So I want to know, can you tell us more? What are you working on? And if you've noticed this topic trending, why do you think that is?
So I think there's a lot of different reasons. First of all, the word narcissism comes from a Greek fable, as we all know, and it became pretty popular with the advent of Freud's pamphlet called On Narcissism. And since then, it's become kind of a favorite topic. A lot of people want to talk about narcissists, narcissism, and I think in general, there's kind of been a trend where an older generation will look at a younger generation and say, you're self-centered and you're all narcissists. And so this is a phenomenon that's not necessarily new. What we have seen recently, though, is kind of a rise in really upfront, outspoken, narcissistic leaders. And I think that kind of public grandiosity is becoming something that everybody's taking note of. And I think because of that, it's become a really popular topic on social media and in the news. But I think it's also become a pretty common word to use in the vernacular.
Yeah, I think it would be important to level set here and just get a definition of what narcissism really is. There's a big difference between, at least in my research that I've done, between someone who is diagnosed narcissistic personality disorder to just having a span of those characteristics. And would you agree or disagree? Truth wise, what do you feel when it comes to narcissism? Everyone has characteristics of narcissism at some level, right?
So it's really fun for everybody to kind of throw this word around and say, oh, you're a narcissist and I'm a narcissist and we're all narcissists. What we're really talking about is a collection of traits, inherent traits, things that we're born with, things that are stable in our personalities. And when they rise to a level where it interrupts our ability to maintain relationships with other people, our ability to maintain a productive work life, or our ability to maintain self-care, then we say it's a disorder. And so, narcissistic personality disorder is the characteristics of narcissism at such a level that it's interfering with your life. Now, most of us, however, do carry around some of these traits, and a lot of us exhibit them to one degree or another in a subclinical way. So when we talk about narcissism, or when we talk about narcissism in leadership or narcissism in the workplace, we have to make a really careful distinction here, because what we're talking about isn't a disorder. It's not a clinical disorder. What we're talking about is really personality traits. And you have heard me say, and I tell everybody, that personality is not a prediction of performance. You may have certain things in your personality that are your preference. Sometimes those preferences are really strong, but they never create behavior. Behavior is always chosen. And so when we talk about narcissism and narcissistic people, we have to remember that they may have some preferences towards narcissistic behavior in their personalities, but that doesn't mean that they have to necessarily act a certain way.
Oh, interesting. So you're saying if I have narcissistic personality traits that are really strong, I can choose consciously to make a different decision, to behave a different way, to act a different way. Is that what I'm hearing?
As can absolutely. So if any personality trait that you identify in yourself or feel in yourself is rising to the level where it's interfering with you reaching your goals, then you always have an opportunity to either work on yourself and your own self development, or find a partner or a wellness provider who's going to be able to help you kind of manage those behaviors yourself.
Well, my background in psychology, I'm fascinated by narcissism and codependency and all of those different topics. What does narcissism look like? If someone is truly, narcissistic personality disorder, what are some examples of behaviors that would show up, whether in the workplace or outside of the workplace? Because we're going to get to leadership in just a moment.
So, again, our personalities don't predict performance. And so we can see a lot of different behaviors from people who are higher in narcissism. But what we want to really look at is where narcissism comes from. People who are higher in narcissism have a deep and meaningful feeling of insecurity, and they lack in true self-confidence. And so somebody who's higher in narcissism, because they're constantly trying to defend themselves from that perceived feeling of insecurity, means that they will exhibit behaviors designed to defend themselves from what they perceive as threats. Sometimes that comes in the form of maybe building themselves up to look like they are better than they actually are, sometimes even lying about characteristics that they have in order to make themselves seem more important or more professional or more powerful. Sometimes that looks like actively trying to subdue things that they perceive as threatening. So if they find themselves in a position where they're in front of somebody that they think is more powerful than them, you may see a narcissist or someone who's higher in narcissism looking at attacking that person and trying to make them seem less powerful. Because again, the underlying theme of narcissism is I don't feel like I'm as good as I should be.
Yeah.
And so I have to force people to believe that I'm better than I am.
It's such a contradiction, right? Internally, they're feeling not secure, they're feeling potentially unstable, but the way that they project that out into the world is by embellishing and I heard grandiosity, right? Like maybe even, what would you say, tactics like manipulation, things like that?
I think the question is what's going to work for that person in that particular time. Again,
Okay.
when we're looking at something like when we're looking at a situation where somebody feels insecure, the threats to their ego or the threats to their self-esteem can seem really dire. And so they may choose really crazy behaviors to try and defend themselves. And again, we're not talking about something that rises to a clinical level, but we are talking about somebody who's really trying to defend who they feel like they are. And I think for a lot of people who are higher in narcissism, the lengths that they'll go to defend themselves can be pretty extreme. And so we want to look at the ways that we are perceiving the people around us, the way that we're perceiving the threats around us, to know if we're making the best decision in that moment.
So interesting. Thank you for sharing. It seems like we've talked a little bit about anyone who's kind of exhibiting this toxic or unhealthy behavior is categorized or labeled with it's a mental health term, right? As narcissist, and that can be damaging. And typically it's clinical psychologists, licensed psychologists are the ones who are properly trained to diagnose someone with a narcissistic personality disorder. I've had experience with narcissism in the past and some encounters with people with those traits, maybe higher narcissism, but again, not diagnosing the person. But what would someone need to know if they were trying to manage a work relationship with someone who has narcissistic characteristics? And like, what are some safeguards?
So I think the most important thing is probably to set up good boundaries. And this is going to
Mm.
be important in every relationship that all of us have all through our lives. But the most important thing is to set up good boundaries. Again, somebody who has high levels of narcissism can tend to feel like they're the most important person, and therefore their issues or their problems or their goals are the most important issues or problems or goals. And because of that, it's quite natural for that person to say, well, my stuff is the most important, so we're going to take care of that first.
Hmm.
And I think that that kind of leads people to think, okay, well, I'm going to take care of that first now, and then next time you'll come back and you'll take care of me, right?
Yeah.
A lot of times we don't get back to the other person because, again, somebody who is constantly concerned with themselves, their own self-esteem, their own self-image, building themselves up, they don't think about other people. They don't even
Mm.
have a chance to consider returning the favor. And so what's the most important thing, and it sounds counterproductive because it's definitely going to trigger something in someone who's high in narcissism, is to say no. No, thank
Ooh.
you. No, thank you. I don't want to do that. No, thank you. I don't want to be there. No, thank you. I don't want to give you my time for that. No. Obviously, when you tell somebody who thinks that they're the most important person and their issues are the most important issues and their goals are the most important goals, no, they're going to have a strong reaction because, again, it comes back to what's going to threaten their perception of their own importance. And by
Mm.
you saying no, you're literally telling them you are not as important as me, and it becomes a direct threat to them. So while you may have some very strong pushback from somebody who has high narcissism in their personality, you will also be setting yourself up for the healthiest relationship with them by setting good, healthy boundaries, by recognizing how much time and energy you're going to allow that person to take from you, by
Ooh.
recognizing how many opportunities you want to miss because you're working with that person, by recognizing that sometimes their energy and the way that they're doing things, particularly at work, can be disruptive to you. And sometimes you need to take a step back and leave. And so the first thing that I would tell anyone who is working with or dealing with somebody who may be higher in narcissistic traits is learn to develop your own self-esteem and learn
Ooh.
to create good boundaries in support of that.
That's so, so good. And like, I'm just like, no is hard for people who are maybe are higher in accommodation, right? Who may have developed people pleasing, I guess, coping mechanisms throughout life. So that's a difficult one. And setting boundaries is a whole nother conversation that we can get into. But like when I think about when someone has higher narcissism, what causes that? Like, how does that develop? People aren't born, right? Am I wrong? People aren't born with narcissism. Is that true? Tell me.
So, people aren't technically born with any personality traits. What we know is that about 60 to 80% of our personality is it comes from our genetics, so our genetic material, our parents' personalities. We're genetically predisposed to have certain personality traits. The rest are developed in our very early childhood. And usually, somewhere between the ages of 4 and 7, our personalities are set. And
Mm.
so, what we find is that people who are higher in narcissistic traits tend to have certain experiences very young that teach them that not only are they the most important person in their life, but also that nobody else is really going to be able to take care of them like they can. And that's one of the reasons why defending themselves and defending their self esteem is so important to them, because they've had experiences early on that have taught them that they're going to need that to survive.
Interesting. Okay. Well, that was setting like a base level. Like, let's just level set what narcissism is, where it's coming from, how we can categorize. And now I want to hear from you about what you're working on in your dissertation, narcissism in leadership. How do those two intersect? Tell me more.
So there's a very specific line of literature that I absolutely fell in love with when I was in my doctoral program, and it's called dark leadership. And dark leadership is narcissistic leaders, Machiavellian leaders, and corporate psychopaths. It is a very interesting line of literature. Should you ever feel the need to read through a bunch of pages of scientific articles. But really, what it looks at is some of the most undesirable traits in personality and how they find themselves into leaders. What we're seeing is that often, for example, in narcissism, often people who are higher in narcissism self select into roles of power and authority, again, because they want to boost their own self esteem. And the traits of those leaders have become sort of the norm for leadership. So command and control types of leadership, charismatic leadership, great man leadership, having somebody at the top of your organization that you can look to, who's going to inspire you, who's going to take care of you, who's going to protect you from all those threats. And that tends to be quite intriguing for a lot of different types of organizations. Often these kinds of leaders are very showy. They get a lot of attention. They get a lot of press. Often they have really big strategic goals, very high level, sometimes really innovative ideas. And a lot of times they can really carry an organization far, particularly when that organization is growing and changing quickly. The challenge is that someone who's higher in narcissism may not be an appropriate leader for every situation or every organization. And what I'm working on is looking at where somebody with those characteristics would fit best. We see that they are self-selecting into leadership positions. We see that they are popular at the top of organizations often. And we see that they have some really positive outcomes when it comes to how they lead their organizations. But we also know of really specific examples where people who are high in narcissism have done horrible things, who have lied, cheated people out of money, ruined entire companies, ruined lives. And so the question is, what's the difference between a Steve Jobs and a Elizabeth Holmes?
Tell me more about that. What do you mean by that?
I think that there are some very clear similarities between some of the greatest leaders in history and some of the worst. And I think it's really important and something that hasn't been well addressed in academia in the leadership field. But I think it's really important to look at what are some of the moderating influences, what are some of the what is the context that we're looking at in these particular examples. I think we need to understand that it isn't just a person, it isn't just a personality that you can plug into a specific position and watch it succeed. There's no magic bullet. What we need to understand more about is what are all the complex scenarios that interact with this particular personality type to make it either very successful or wholly unsuccessful.
You very just lightly dropped a twist in this whole conversation. We're talking about narcissism in leadership, and you just lightly put it down that narcissism potentially has benefits in leadership. I don't know if anyone, like, I picked up on that right away. I heard you say that there are potential benefits of narcissistic leadership, and I can understand how someone who is higher in narcissism, how they can self-select into leadership roles. What I can't understand is sustainability of them in those roles. So getting there, right, especially at the most opportune time, high-paced growth of an organization, maybe they're growing from small to mid to even large, mid to large firms, right? I can see those characteristics like setting ambitious goals really supporting the phase of the organization and their growth phase at that time. But my confusion is around sustainability, because we could probably talk for hours about this, but dysfunctional cultures and how do people, like employee morale, can you just help me, synthesize all of these thoughts?
So, first of all, I am not the first person to imply that there may be some benefits for higher people who are higher in narcissism in positions of leadership. Just like you touched on, there are certainly a lot of examples of people who are uh, suspected of having higher narcissism. Obviously, I haven't sat down with Steve Jobs and I didn't analyze his personality, so I can't say for sure. But what we can say is that there are leaders who are suspected of having a high degree of narcissism who have done really amazing things for their organizations. Steve Jobs is a perfect example. You can look at certain types of church leaders. There are certain types of um, famous people, certainly people who work in entertainment. I mean, they're irrespective of industry. There are some places where a narcissist could be very helpful. Again, they are incredibly charismatic, which
Mm-hmm.
means that a lot of times they are interesting to listen to. They are evangelizing people to the organization. And certainly at the top of an organization, if we're talking about the C-suite, the number one goal for an executive there is to make sure that they're raising money, raising capital for their organization to continue on. And so narcissists tend to be really effective there. They also tend to pick up projects that other people won't. They have
Oh.
a very strong sense of self and a sense of belief in their own success. And so sometimes they're able to really push through and do things that other people just would have cut ties on and run. And so for that reason, we can see that there are successes for those who are higher in narcissism. However, just as you mentioned, it tends to not be that sustainable. And so what we see is, again, a narcissist is going to push those boundaries. They're going to get as much as they can get out of people. And potentially, when they're set with some roadblocks or some good boundaries, they can step outside of what is normal protocol or even legal in order to accomplish their goals. I think that's one of the reasons why it's so important for organizations who are looking for this kind of fast-paced, smooth talking, really successful looking leader. It's important to set up a system around them that is going to make sure that they don't hurt themselves or the organization.
That's what I was going to ask you, is it's awareness of this type of leader in this leadership role has to be absolutely critical, whether it's other, C-suite members or it's the board, having the awareness to be able to provide that support system and have those systems in place, those tactics, those safeguards, so to speak, that has to be critical. But how do you get there? How do organizations get there? If there's someone who's like recognizing that there's potentially someone with higher narcissism in a really important critical key role in their company, let's say C-suite, how do they get there?
So we've seen this happen before. And I think one of the most interesting parts of the Steve Jobs story is when he stepped away from Apple at its height and took a little sabbatical and then was able to come back and re-energize the organization in the same way that he did when he started it. I think that sabbatical was time for him to step away, do some self-development, some self-growth, and really figure out what the most productive way to use his skills and his personality was going to be in order to drive the goals of that organization. I think every other organization needs to encourage their leadership to do the same thing. It is so important that people have a sense of self-awareness,
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily even for publication. There are very few leaders who will go through a public personality assessment and then broadcast their results to everybody who has an interest. But I think it's the self-awareness that is the most important thing. So allowing that person the space and giving them the encouragement to really do some reflection. Most people that I work with who have narcissistic traits don't actually want to hurt people, but they feel like the damage that they do is kind of justified by the means that they're achieving in the end, and or the end that they're achieving with those means.
Like a coping
And so
mechanism, right? It's
I think
survival.
it's a survival mechanism, and I
Mm-hmm.
think that there is a real need for that person to have the space and the support to recognize that that may not actually be the most productive way to handle situations. So that's number one. Giving somebody that you suspect is higher in narcissism the space to do their own self-work and development is a great idea. I would not try to go and convince them that you know what their personality is. And I wouldn't try to convince them that you know what the best thing for their personality is. That's something that they can do with their coach, with their mentor, with their spouse, with their therapist if they feel like they need one. Giving them that space and time and the respect to do that self work that they need to do is first. Obviously, the second step is that organizations, if they see that they have a highly charismatic leader who is dogged in pursuing their goals and often does not take criticism or critique from anyone else, I think now we need to think about setting up those good systems and boundaries around that person. So making sure that the rest of the executive suite is there to support that person, but also provide a critical eye to some of their plans, making sure that if there is a separate board, that the board is prepared to provide guidance and boundaries to that person as well. Again, someone who is higher in narcissism views their goals as just the most important goals in the world. And so by setting up boundaries and by telling them no, you will get pushback,
Mm-hmm.
but often that pushback ends up creating the kind of constructive conflict that actually leads to innovation.
That's so interesting. You have to be someone who can handle the pushback, right? To be able to not recoil when you get, that strong pushback. And I'm curious to know, like, do narcissists even know they're narcissists? Do they have that level of self-awareness? Do they or no?
I think that everybody has a different level of self awareness. And I think it would be so difficult to quantify.
Mm.
I know this about myself, but, in a quiet room when I'm not really doing anything, maybe I know a little bit more about myself. And I think the awareness piece is important for them to figure out. Um, but again, I think everybody's awareness is different.
Yeah. I want to go back to this idea of like narcissists, people hire narcissism, like picking up, if they're in leadership positions, picking up extra projects, right? The projects no one wants to do, that level of self efficacy. Is that driven from true self efficacy or something to prove?
So it's actually interesting. A lot of times, I think it might have been Michael Jordan who said, "You miss you miss all the 100% of the shots you don't take." So I think there's a little bit of that in narcissism, is that they're just more apt to take on projects, to have stretch goals, and so I think they are, because of that, quite successful oftentimes.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's another part of it that is. I would call it a useful delusion. I think so. Shankar Vedantam wrote a book called Useful Delusion a couple years ago, and it was about how all of us sort of tell ourselves little stories, and we make up little scenarios in our head,
Sure.
and sometimes they're true and sometimes they're not. And sometimes the little stories that we tell ourselves can actually lead to an increased sense of self-efficacy, an improvement in our own self-esteem.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes just telling little lies or making up little stories can be really useful in convincing us that we have the ability to be successful. Somebody who's higher in narcissism is just going to do that kind of naturally.
Mm-hmm.
And so because of that, they're going to take more shots, which means they're going to make more shots. And that's going to create even more of a sense of self-efficacy and self-esteem in them, which is going to allow them to go forward and be more bold and be greater risk takers. People who are high in narcissism have incredible risk tolerance.
Oh, but I wanted to say about that thought that you were sharing, like the people around it, you know how you said that you have to have like a nice support system around those individuals? That also starts to make me think about the characteristics of those individuals that you have around them and being more intentional, strategic with that. Because what comes to mind is you were saying, you know, you have to have some like compassion for this being a human being, right? And they are, you know, suffering in some ways. And so I think that, you know, having some people around that, you know, are in that support system that you know, have emotional regulation abilities, who are high in emotional intelligence, who are empathetic, who can display compassion. And I would agree with you on what you've been talking about is self-esteem. If you can build your own self-esteem up, if you have high self-esteem and you're around narcissism, you can set those boundaries. You're not absorbing or internalizing anything that they're projecting onto you. And you have the mindset of what they're saying, even though it's callous, is not about me, it's about them, right?
I think that's an excellent way to sum it up. You have to find people or develop people to put around that person who are both empathetic and high in emotional intelligence, but also strong and self-assured. And that's very few people. I don't even know that I would necessarily qualify for that position all the time. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's really important that as you look at structuring an organization or a system around a narcissist, that you also create systems where the people who are supporting that narcissist have their own support. Remember,
Mm.
somebody who is higher in narcissism believes that the accomplishment of their goals is the most important thing. So they're gonna take the path of least resistance, even if that means exploiting people's weaknesses, manipulating.
Self-preservation, right?
Yes. And so for them, it's life or death. So remember to put people around them who are more difficult to exploit, who maybe don't have as many weaknesses that could be targeted, because again, it
Mm.
is so important to give that person an opportunity. If they have the characteristics of narcissism, they need an opportunity to self-develop, but you can't force them to self-develop. You can only make it in their best interests to
Uh,
self-develop. And so you can do that by creating good boundaries, good systems around them, putting people around them who are already developed or who are working on themselves. And that creates an environment where it's not only um, useful and helpful for that person to develop to more productive characteristics of their traits, but also that it's safe for
mm.
them, which is important for somebody who is struggling with an internal feeling that they are not safe and not enough.
Just my mind is blown up with all of these other, you know, questions and thoughts, and we talked about so many different aspects of narcissism in leadership and narcissism in the C-suite and how it can benefit an organization. And that's usually not the story that we're hearing, right? And so it's such an important I think conversation to have. I immediately want to go into psychological safety of the employees around them, and that's just my mind going in a bunch of different directions. We can talk for hours about this, but I think this is a great first conversation. So I first of all just love to invite you back in a future episode. We can continue the conversation on. And I like to like end the episodes with a final question. And I didn't tell you about this, so you're gonna be like on the spot a little bit. But to stay true to the paradigm shifts concept of this podcast, I'd like to ask you, what's a recent paradigm shift that you've had, whether it's related to this work that you're doing or anything outside of that? What's the most recent paradigm shift that you've encountered?
I think maybe it's not a shift that I've encountered, but it's one that I see coming.
Mm.
What I'm looking at, I study narcissism in academia, but my work is talent development. And what I'm seeing with the pandemic and with a real shift in technology is we're getting closer to what I call full integration of work. We're currently having a lot of conversations about where people work and how much they work and what we can put in their work to make them work better and how we can select personalities for good work. And I think one of the things that I'm watching kind of come towards the field of talent development is the idea that we can structure work to fully integrate with an individual's life. That means that we don't have to worry about 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, no holidays on this specific day, take your 30-minute lunch, wear a specific outfit to work. These things are distractions. And I think that technology and an emphasis on well-being at work is going to push work into a place where it's more fully integrated with our lives, where you can send off an important email while you're pouring your morning coffee, and then you can go play with your dog for 15 minutes, come back, write, a report or have your morning meetings, go out to lunch with your spouse or cook a good meal at home, maybe drive into the office a couple of days a week to really have team building, skill building, and then, come home and take a 4-day weekend just because you feel like it.
Oh, wow.
To me, it sounds like heaven, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there are more and more people and more organizations who are supporting living that kind of life where you don't have a work life and a home life.
Yeah.
You work in your life. You fully integrate accomplishing your purpose with who you are as a person. And I think that to me is a paradigm shift that I am watching on the horizon, and I'm excited to see it, kind of unfold in our environment now. And I'm hoping that it is coming soon.
Oh my goodness. A couple words come to mind: quality of life. And I'm also seeing it, but you bringing it to the surface, it just makes me more, cognitive of it. It's such an amazing thing to watch. And so many people have access to this type of integration because they work with an organization that have those resources and maybe that leadership to lead the charge, but not everyone does. And so what I'm hearing you say is that might become more widespread where, an individual contributor maybe would have those capabilities or that freestyle to the way that their work and life is integrated. Is that what I'm hearing?
I think you can start with individual contributors. I see no reason that teams could not work this way. I see no reason why organizations couldn't work this way as well. I think it would take a shift in the way that we do things and our expectations of people. I think a lot of things would need to change for us to get there, but I think it is such a worthy goal, and I think it would create so much more productivity and so much better quality of life and just general pleasantness that I think I see no reason why this would not be a priority for every organization in, say, 50 years. In 50 years, our grandchildren will laugh at us that we went into an office 40 hours a week, 50 weeks out of the year. They will laugh hysterically at us.
I love it. No, that's so good. So good. And we spend, like I've talked about in this podcast, 70% or more, 3/4 of our lifetime at work. If we're not enjoying it, right? If we don't have a sense of quality of life all around, like how are we maximizing our human potential? How are we living our best lives? So I want to just...
Yeah.
This has been such a pleasure, Erika. And I just want to wrap up and just say thank you so much for joining me today in this conversation. There's obviously so many more conversations that we can and need to have. If I can get you on in a future episode. So thank you so much.
Well, it was a pleasure being here. I appreciate you inviting me. I'm always happy to talk about my favorite topic, narcissists. And I'm even more happy to hear what you're doing and the paradigms that you're shifting and listen to more of your guests talk about what they're doing in this work.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, let's shift some paradigms. Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to leave a review, rate, and subscribe wherever you're listening. If you know a business leader in practice or friend who you think would be interested in this episode, please consider sharing it with them. I am so grateful for your support. For more updates, you can follow us at Paradigm Shifts Podcast on Instagram. See you on the next episode.